I'd like to talk to you briefly about stamp hinging. I'm not going to get into the debate about which stamps should be hinged, whether any stamps should be hinged, whether used stamps or previously hinged mint stamps are okay to hinge. What I would just like to show you is how I believe a stamp should be hinged, because I've just stepped away from a stamp collection which has been ruined, and I felt it was time to put together a quick film, so I've torn the camera down and balanced it so I can show you this view. It's a little demonstration I've made up. Obviously one doesn't normally hinge stamps to black cardboard, but I thought it showed them up quite well. So what you've got here is a stamp with a hinge already affixed to the back, and you will see that the top edge of that hinge is roughly 2 millimeters from the top of the stamp. It's not an exact science, but what you have to avoid is hinging a stamp too low on the back of a stamp or too high on the back of a stamp. And I'll show you why. Because your stamps do need occasionally to be inspected on the back. Maybe when you have bought your stamp, you never want to see the back of it again. That's perfectly fine. But the next collector who owns your stamps, or the next dealer or auctioneer who has to assess your stamps, he will want to look at the back of the stamp. So you need to be able to do this. Without damaging the stamp at all. You'll note it's possible to pull the stamp away from its album page somewhat, because the longer edge of the hinge is not fully wet, it's just the bottom quarter or third. So there we go. Now why should we worry about this? Well, if you hinge the stamp too far down the back, this is what you do when you turn it over. You crease your stamp across the middle. What a nightmare. What happens if you hinge it too high up? Well, first of all, if you can certainly inspect the back of the stamp, but when time comes to, say, take it away from the page, you have to cut through the hinge, and you end up with an unsightly piece of paper sticking up above the stamp. Why would you want to cut through the hinge and not remove it? Well, you've now stuck the stamp hinge to the back of the perforation, so delicate little teeth along the top, and if you try and remove that hinge when it's stuck to the back of those perforation teeth, then you are liable to take one of the teeth with the hinge and remove it. That's terrible. The third crime, so we've got middle stamp hinging, above the stamp hinging. The third crime is the mega tongue. Even used stamps often have bits of old gum and whatnot on the back of them, and gum can get transferred from the hinge to the back of the stamp if you salivate too much when you see your stamps. And consequently, if you wet everything on the back of the hinge and you're not careful, it's stuck to the page and you pull it off and you create a thin patch on the back of that stamp. So, what's the best way of doing it? Well, I have a secret. I use my tongue. have seen people who like to have a wet sponge on their desk. I personally would be very nervous about having anything that's permanently wet on my desk. You get a bit of damp on your fingers, on anything else that's been near that sponge, and a stamp goes near it. You end up having to lever your precious stamp off something you've glued it to. So if we just have a look carefully at what a stamp hinge actually is, it is a little piece of paper with a short edge, which I'm holding now, and a long edge. The outside of that hinge has glue on it, which is water activated. The short edge, which affixes to the top, near the top of the stamp, as I explained earlier, should be lightly dampened using your tongue. I'll save you this, and then delicately placed and immediately opened out, and any excess liquid either allowed to dry or brushed away. There we go, a perfectly half hinge stamp. Then you want to affix it to your page. So here we go. You lift the hinge up away from the stamp, protect the stamp with your tweezers, and only hinge that top third or quarter of that long edge, like that. Put the stamp down and place it where you want it placed. Gently, no pushing, and leave it up to make sure there's no excess liquid. You can then, don't worry, when the album sits down on top of that stamp it'll remain flat. And there we go. Now the other system I've seen employed is often employed by people who use printed album pages. They know exactly where their stamp's going to go, and so they pre-hinge the space, and you can see there, perfectly hinged along the bottom edge, and then using a damp finger for safety they can just dampen that little bit there, and then put the stamp like so. There we go. The stamp can be turned and inspected, no problem. There's a lot more to it, of course, but that is how a stamp should look when it's properly hinged. Not too much tongue, not mounted too high on the back of the stamp, not mounted too low on the back of the stamp. It should not be completely adhered to the page because there was too much moisture on the hinge. Even if the moisture doesn't go onto the album page, if that whole long edge, there we go, is wet, it stops the stamp being turned over properly. Whatever is above that hinge will be folded. So please practice with some cheap stamps like I did there. In many ways hinging is the best way to display stamps because you don't have anything between you and the stamp. But as I said at the start of this little piece, I would much rather avoid being prescriptive in this video about what, if anything, hinging may do to the value of your stamps. Anyway, calm down now. Hopefully I've helped someone. Thanks.